So nice to welcome golf course designer, renovator, and restorer Gil Hanse to Questions for Cancer Research tonight. Great to see you, Gil. How are you?
I'm doing great, Chris. Thank you very much.
Gil, you are probably the busiest man in golf these days. For anyone out there watching, Gil has been kind enough to join me at 8 o'clock tonight after putting in a full day down here in South Florida. So appreciative of his time. So kind of you to do this. Gil, let's start with, I'm not sure you like or dislike the title. I'm assuming you probably dislike, but without a doubt, you are the modern day open doctor. In recent years, you've worked with several major venues, including Baltusrol, Brookline, LA Country Club, Marion, Oakland Hills, Oakmont, and Winged Foot. Gil, how did all this start? What attracted you initially to golf course design?
Um, yes, and no, I don't really enjoy the open doctor moniker. I think that should stay in the Jones family. Obviously Trent had it, and then Reese, and both appropriately so. I mean, obviously they worked on a ton of venues, so maybe somebody will come up with something a little bit more fitting for me. But I am 100% honored that we get to work on these great golf courses, and that we've been entrusted with so many of them. And my golf journey started on a great old golf course, Southward Ho on Long Island, and A.W. Tillinghast Golf Course, where my grandfather was a member. He was the only golfer in our family, and as far as I was concerned, he hung the moon. I mean, he was just a very special, one of the nicest people I've ever been around in my life. And I always often think of him and try to pattern my behavior after the way he handled himself. But he invited me to go play golf, and I don't know whether it was his presence in the golf landscape or just the beauty of a golf landscape that attracted me to that, to golf courses. And so I started doodling golf holes and never really understood how you would go about becoming a golf architect, and didn't set out to be one. So I went to the University of Denver, studied political science and history. Two things, subjects I'm fascinated by even to this day. But that's one of those degrees is like, okay, now what do you do when you graduate? And so you either go to law school or grad school. And I wound up going to Cornell for grad school and studying city and regional planning. In my first semester, I was taking a course in landscape architecture based on history of park design. And I met a guy who was in that class, Tom Griswold, who was studying to be a golf course architect. And he subsequently went on to work for Tom Fazio for 25 years and had a great career. And I went home, like I was so excited. I went home to Tracy. We weren't married at the time, we were engaged. But I said, listen, I've just found out, how you become a golf architect. I've been doodling holes all this time, but and she, as she's always been, was incredibly supportive, and just, it was going to take an extra year of grad school. And so first summer I worked maintenance at the Country Club of Ithaca. Second summer I worked golf course construction for Tom Doak on his first golf course, High Point up in Michigan. And then third summer I spent over in Great Britain. And then when I graduated, I went to work for Tom Doak. So it was not a linear path by any stretch of the imagination, but it all started, looking at one of the A.W. Tillinghast golf courses, and I was hooked.
Yeah, hey, good for you. You really went in and did what you loved in life, and obviously that's probably why you've been so good at it. Would you say that the majority of your work with a venue prior to hosting a major is tournament-specific renovation, or more restoration related in terms of preparing the course to play as the original designer had intended?
It's more restoration based. My partner Jim Wagner and I have always believed that those guys were so good at what they did that yes, we have to add back tees, and yes, we may have to move bunkers downrange and accommodate the modern game, but at its core, all of the designs of the Tillinghast or Ross or McKenzie were so solid and so good that they would be able to challenge today's golfers. And so we look at it first and foremost through the lens of restoration. What can we do to restore their work as close as possible, with, as I mentioned, the odd changes in order to accommodate the modern game. And then, if we're working in a place like Winged Foot, you're going to host major championships or Baltusrol, et cetera. So you don't go into it saying, well, we're going to restore it and hope it's good enough for a major championship, because they're coming. But what we ultimately decide is that we have to trust that what those guys did by putting it back will still provide a legitimate test for the best golfers in the world in this day and age. And lo and behold, it does. And I think what we've learned over a period of time is that we just have to trust those guys. We just have to basically say, we believe that given the contours of the greens and the strategic setup and the way they put the golf courses in the land, those are all still incredibly relevant and still incredibly pertinent to today's game. And so by putting our trust in Tillinghast or Rayner or whatever, we feel like we're still going to come out on the other end with a great championship golf course in this day and age.
Yeah, I'm sure the more and more you got into this, you were probably pretty surprised, right? As you started the process of going back and finding old photographs. As you got into this, it must have been pretty amazing to see how much the courses had changed. I mean, in some cases, 100+ years, but I bet it was pretty surprising to you to see how much they'd changed from the original design.
Yes, yeah, you're right. I mean, it is amazing to see what is basically it's evolution, right? I mean, in some instances, you had an architect who would come in and make significant changes, under the guise of modernization or trying to change that design of the original designer. And this would have generally happened sometime in the 50s or 60s. Reversing that is really the biggest architectural change, but the rest of it is more just evolution of trees being planted and growing and mowing lines changing and courses narrowing and the introduction of irrigation kind of moving everything in. And then you get to, okay, did they fill in bunkers? Did they add cart paths? I mean, cart paths are like the worst, introduction to these great old golf courses because they're so compact in nature. You flow from one hole right to the next, and now you got to put a slab of asphalt in between a green and a tee. And how does that work? And generally speaking, it's never done very artfully or skillfully. So now you're trying to re-engineer the surrounds. And then the other thing too are greens. Greens shrinking over a period of time. It's not like somebody set out and said, well, let's just make these greens smaller. It's that evolution. So with the exception of the courses where we've had, architects who've gone in and really made significant alterations to the original design, most of the changes are evolution based.
Yeah, yeah. I think most golfers could agree that maybe the worst feeling in the game is when you pull a shot left or right, you hit a cart path, and you go out of bounds. That's a pretty tough break, right?
It is, and we've gotten to the point where we will try the best we can to obviously get them out of play and get them out of sight, but also we try really hard not to have the walking part of the game, like walking from green to the next tee, where you have to cross a cart path. We don't have that sound anymore that you and I both will remember of, spikes on asphalt, that crunching sound of moving through the golf landscape. But, nowadays, still the feeling of stepping onto asphalt or having to cross over a path I don't think that adds to the character or the feel of walking a golf course. So where we can, we really try to remove that as well.
Right, right. Great, great. Gil, let me ask you about the site of this year's U.S. Open, Oakmont Country Club, only a month away now. Prior to the last Open played there in 2016, I've heard estimates that as many as 12,000 trees were actually removed from the course. I remember seeing some media coverage of the course before the tournament in 2016, and it was pretty shocking to see very few trees on the course at that point. It's been reported that many of the trees were planted for strategic purposes, as you just said, in the 50s and 60s. The club was founded in 1903. Does the course today resemble the original layout in terms of the amount of trees?
It does. It's actually, and the restoration work that we did over the last couple of years, now really, I think the golf course feels a lot closer to the original design, or at least the design over the period of time when the Phones family was instrumental in guiding all of the changes and everything that happened on the golf course. So from a period of 1903 to 1947, you either had Henry Phones, the father, or William Phones, the son, in basically running the golf operation there and making significant changes to the golf course. But it was all in-house, so it felt like we could look at that 40-year period of time and decide, were there iterations of certain holes that were better than others. And then would we basically try to bring some of those back? And what we decided on with the support of the club was that we would basically build an eclectic golf course. And I'm just going to make up years because I can't remember exactly what the years were. But, say the best version of the first hole was 1931, and the best version of the second hole, in our opinion, was 1937, and best version of the third hole was 1928. So we basically put together an eclectic design, all based on the phone's family input. And so what you're going to see in a month's time is a depiction of not Oakmont at any one point in time. Like, we didn't go back and say, the high water mark for Oakmont's design was 1930. We basically looked over that long period of time. And so you're going to see a golf course that has elements of architectural evolution, but carried out all by the same two people.
Right. It's an amazing process. You're going back a long way in time to actually come up with these pictures. And, I know a guy at like Neil Regan at Wingfoot, right? I mean, he's extremely helpful. And now I don't know if all these great courses have a Neil Regan these days, but I mean, it's pretty amazing that you are able to locate that many photos, going back, 70, 80, 100 plus years.
Yeah, and we're fortunate, right? I mean, Chris, a lot of these golf courses have hosted championships since their inception. So, there are photos from Oakmont in the early, aughts and the teens in the 1900s. So we have ground shots. That was before aerial photography really took off, which was in the mid to late 20s. And then starting in the mid to late 20s, we have all kinds of aerial photography. But the club does have a wonderful archive. They've done a great job of saving and organizing and putting together. No mystical feature or person like Neil Regan, who was, as you mentioned, he was integral to the success of our work at Wingfoot and was out there with us in the dirt over. And anytime we had to basically say, hey, we need a picture of 7 West, it would magically appear on his iPad. So we were very, very fortunate to have that. So we haven't had anybody as thorough or as wonderful as Neil on these projects, but we do have an amazing amount of archival information in places like Marion, Oakmont, Los Angeles Country Club, et cetera.
Right. Let me just ask you quickly. I don't know if the actual definition of a link style course is it's supposed to be seaside, but we kind of have a picture of it, what a link style course looks like. And I mean, that's pretty much, I think, given, the removal of trees, Oakmont to me kind of looks like a link style course. Is it considered link style?
Not really. I mean, you're right. Technically, you need to be near the seaside and then an estuary to have formed and left behind deposits. There's I could really geek out on you with that, but I think it's just, the common part of the language of the game of golf is a golf course without trees on it is generally referred to as a link style golf course. And so I think if you're just having that as a general conversation, that would paint a picture that most people could understand and say, okay, yes, I get that. I think the Phones is just inherited an open piece of land, and they built a golf course that was rugged and that fit that piece of land, and the scale of it fit that piece of land. It's not like they went in and cleared a bunch of trees in order to create their golf course. They just had this big open plateau that overlooked the river, and then obviously overlooked, well, the turnpike wasn't there when they built it, but there was a railway line that ran through that cavern that sits down there. So I think, they had a piece of land that they built the architecture and they scaled the architecture to fit a big, broad, open piece of land. And now the fact that you can walk out of that clubhouse and look all the way across and see all the way up to the third green and the third hole, which is the farthest point away, gives you that sense of space and scale, which would have been completely taken away when all the trees were introduced over time. And, we've talked about that evolution, and, that just happened to be, and I hope we don't, I won't be here, you won't be, but, in 50 years, if somebody's talking about this period of time in golf architecture, they say, well, it was a fad or it was an era, to cut trees and do restoration, which, I think it's proven that this is the right way to go as it relates to quality of golf. And I think ultimately, as well as respecting the work of people who came before us. But I think in the 50s and 60s, when golf first appeared on television, you got a situation where you first saw Augusta National, and there were all these beautiful trees, and then the rankings started to come out in the early '60s, and Pine Valley was ranked #1. And what did Pine Valley have? All kinds of trees on it. And then the other part of the evolution is you would have irrigation introduced, and you weren't going to irrigate this gigantic open area. You were going to do basically 1 or 2 lines down the middle of each fairway. And then now what happens to all this extra space? Well, it looks kind of odd that you've got this green strip running through this big open area. So people just started planting trees and filling in space. So it wasn't necessarily architecturally driven. I think it was more aesthetically driven, and it was more spatially driven. And then over time, when these trees grew and filled in, and they became a part of the playability of the golf course because they started to intrude on the actual lines of play and what the original architects were trying to have you do, then they became known, in my opinion, erroneously, as strategic elements of the golf course. And so Oakmont, starting I think in the late '90s, just took it upon themselves to start getting rid of them, and they did an amazing job.
Yeah, that's amazing. Oakmont has earned the reputation, Gil, as the most difficult of the U.S. Open venues. Dustin Johnson was the winner of the 2016 Open with a score of 4 under. Since that time, you and your team were brought in to make some changes. From what I've read, you guys have added 150 yards in length, so to play par 70, about 73, 72 yards. The greens have been expanded. You've extended the world famous church pew bunkers by 1 more pew. And it sounds as though the USGA will not be employing a graduated rough setup. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that you've done and how the course will compare to 2016?
Yeah, I mean, we did find some significant length on a handful of holes. I think we're closer to 250 yards or maybe even 300 yards that we found. I don't know if they'll use it all, but we did find some yardage there. You're correct about the graduated rough. As of right now, all the conversations are that they will not do that. They will just go with 1 height of cut, which is yet to be determined. The expansion of the greens is going to create significantly new, additional hole locations that I've been fortunate to have been involved in walking around with the USGA setup team back in the fall, and we were exploring all the new hole locations that are available to them. And I don't know how many they will use, but there will be, I would think they will use 1 or 2 per hole for during the 4 rounds of golf. So I think you're going to see the traditional ones that, especially on 18 on Sunday, but I think you're going to see some new hole locations, which will provide interesting challenges. A lot of the green expansion work also involves removing all the sand buildup along the edges of the greens. So the greens had this sort of bowl-like effect around the edges. That is now gone, and balls that get anywhere near the edge are going to go off either into the rough or into bunkers. So they'll be less forgiving as it relates to the surrounds and the edges of the greens. We all know that if Mother Nature cooperates, those greens will be running as fast as any greens anywhere, and they'll be firm as well. So I think one of the other things we've learned is that while we've added all these architectural aspects to it, or restored these architectural aspects to it, shifted bunkers downrange, et cetera, at the end of the day, it's all about the weather that week. I mean, it's whatever Mother Nature provides. If it rains the whole time and the golf course is soft, then it's going to play difficult because the rough is wet, because the ball's not running, and it's going to play longer, but the greens will be more receptive. If it's firm and fast, it'll be a completely different set. But one thing we do know is that Oakmont, traditionally, very much like the golf course behind you, Wingfoot, has always been a very, very stern test of golf, and I think the USGA is prepared to let Oakmont be Oakmont this year.
That's pretty interesting. As I said, it's got the reputation being the toughest, and I think it's very easy sometimes to look at Oakmont and say, well, typically we'll have the toughest rough and the fastest greens. Is that pretty much what makes it so tough? But I think there's more to it. What really puts the bite in that golf course?
But working out there and spending as much time as we did, and shout out to Kevin Murphy from our team, and Kai Golby and Matt Smallwood, who were with us all every step of the way. Those guys did amazing work out there with us on the golf course. Watching the ball react in the fairways is really something that I think is underappreciated at Oakmont. If the weather conditions allow, they keep their fairways fairly tight and very firm, and the level of precision required to sort of hit a half of the fairway or a 10-yard wide strip, like on the 12th hole, if you don't hit it down the left-hand side, that ball is going to go all the way across the fairway and wind up in the right-hand rough. And you've got a situation where it's not talked a lot about. You're right. It's rough, it's bunkers, it's green speed and greens that run away from you, et cetera. But I think the topography in the fairways at Oakmont is something that I know I'll be paying a lot more attention to, having spent time observing how the members play the golf course. And I think it'll be really very, very interesting to watch the players control their ball so that it takes the slope and either gains a huge advantage by rolling further downhill or hits the proper side of the fairway so it actually stays in the fairway, or they try to set up a good angle into the greens, and they've either got to hit a draw to hold the left-hand side or hit a cut to let it feed to the right. So I think there's going to be an awful lot of interest in the tee balls and how they hit them in order to keep them in the fairways.
Interesting. Yeah, as you said, Gil, a lot will depend on the weather conditions, so tough to predict. But based on what you're saying, it certainly sounds like it would not be surprising to see a winning score above par this year.
I think that would be, that could be an outcome. These guys are so good, though. You never, I was having dinner with a friend tonight, and we were chatting about, what will the winning score be? And I think it will be somewhere around even par, unless you get somebody like, people talk about Bryson at Winged Foot, and he shot, I think, 6 under. And people go, oh, well, it was easy. Well, he was the only guy under par. So, the score might be a little bit better in relation to par if one person happens to kind of go off and have just a great 4 rounds of golf like Bryson did. And then the rest of the field was probably more indicative of how difficult the golf course was with, I think Matt Wolff was even par, and he was the only guy who was not over par aside from with he and Bryson.
Right. Gil, my next question was kind of to take us through the history of the whole tree removal program, and I think you did a pretty good job of that. But kind of a secondary question on that is, can Greens Committee members kind of keep their hands off? Is that something that's still somewhat prevalent, or I think people are learning, hey, if you've got a great golf course here, it's time for hands off?
I think that was, earlier in my career, and certainly at different clubs that we were dealing with, that was probably more prevalent. I think now that we're fortunate, we're dealing with the Wingfoots of the world and et cetera, that doesn't happen very much because the leadership at the club is such that their golf IQ is high enough that they understand that it's better to leave those decisions to either the professional superintendent or golf architect, or to follow a master plan, or to have something put in that they basically blocks that temptation. So I can't think of the last time that happened where we had a green chairman go rogue or say, hey, we're going to go and do this. And it would have to be probably over 20 years ago. So thankfully, we don't have to deal with that very often.
Yeah, it sounds like we've come a long way there. Yeah.
Yes.
When it comes to the process of green complex restoration, we know a couple of things. First, on many of the great courses, the green complexes have greatly changed over the years, and as you said, in many cases becoming smaller. And secondary, green speeds were much slower when the courses were originally designed. Do you run across many cases in your restoration work where you say that the original green design simply won't work given the speed of today's championship greens?
Never that it won't work. I think there are certain aspects of it that won't work because I think I'm trying to think of the most like severe greens that we've worked and touched, and it would be number one at Wingfoot West. Um, and that works, or number 9 or number 18 at Southern Hills, and they work, but we've had to do just a little bit of massaging to create more opportunities for hole locations. So there have always been hole locations. They've just been restricted in usage, and you don't want to see, major championship where all 4 hole locations are like in a 20-foot area. And so I think in order to gain some variety and gain other options, we've been willing and able to go in and very, very carefully manipulate slopes in order to create areas for hole locations. And if we do our job properly, we take the area and we expand it like into collars or into surrounds so that we stretch that area enough, but not so much on the internal part of the green that it gets noticed by the members. Because if you're trying to raise an area to create let's just say raise and create a plateau, if you have to stretch that out into the middle of the green, then how does your tie-in work? Where does that ultimately connect back into the internal part of the green, which is the part of the green the members know and understand because they put on it all the time. Whereas if you can take that plateau and then create the landform and stretch it into the surrounds over a bunker or into the rough or into the collar, you can make that tie-in fit. Then ultimately you can create a situation where the members have a new hole location, but they don't necessarily have the feeling that you've changed a significant part of the green. So if you're conscientious about how you handle it and you make the tie-in big enough or broad enough or stretch it long enough, then I think you can create hole locations without, as my partner Jim Wagner says, doing the Mr. Potato Head, where you're sticking a ear on the side of it, and everybody kind of looks at it and goes, "Boy, it looks like somebody stuck an ear on the side of that head."
Yeah. You touched on it briefly before, but we hear of mowing patterns, grass creep, and financial costs as being kind of the main reasons for greens shrinking over the years. Is that pretty much what has happened over the years?
Yes, I think it's more the creep. It's like if you think about it, if you have a green and you lose through no one's fault or just no one paying attention, you lose an inch or two every year, and you extrapolate that out over 40 or 50 years, it starts to turn into something significant. And some of these greens, these great old golf courses went through World War II, or the Depression, where they were just purposely scaling stuff down because they didn't have the resources or the manpower to maintain them during those, and then they just were never brought back out. And then I think in fewer examples, there have been areas where clubs have just looked at something and just said, well, you can't put a pin there, so why are we maintaining that green height? Let's just save 200 square feet of greens maintenance, and we just let that go to rough. Because what they don't appreciate is that the original architect intended that, even though he flared it up where he wasn't going to put a pin there, it was part of the recovery process, that somebody might aim at that if they're playing out of the rough or out of a bunker to try and get the ball to go up and feed back to a hole location. So it's a little bit short-sighted, and certainly doesn't do anything to benefit the architecture by letting areas like that grow in, but we have heard that as well.
Gil, let me ask you about a pretty interesting, somewhat of a debate in the game today. We have a bit of a divide in golf as to whether equipment should be dialed back to reduce distance. It's controversial with big names and ruling parties on both sides of the argument. We don't know what the future holds, and I'm not going to ask your opinion. We're going to save you that. We don't want to create any enemies here. But as you mentioned, we saw Bryson DeChambeau flex his muscle at Wingfoot in 2020, play very well out of the rough with wedges and high irons. His finish, it was either 5 or 6 under. And as you said, he was the only one under par. But I still think it's fair to say he surprised a lot of people with that score. If distance isn't rolled back, or at least somewhat curtailed, what can some of the top venues do to stay relevant in terms of hosting majors, as many will soon run out of room to expand?
I think ultimately distance isn't the main line of defense for these great old golf courses. I mean, the main line of defense is the rough, and it's their putting surfaces. It's the fact that taking the contours of someplace like Oakmont or Winged Foot or Augusta or Pinehurst and stimping them at 13. That's the defense, right? You have to be so precise in how you're striking the ball into these areas that you leave yourself with the chance to make a putt and not three putt, right? So, I mean, there's that level of precision ultimately comes down to finding the fairway and then ultimately finding the proper portion of the green in order to score. And so I think that will always be the defense of these great old golf courses. You're right. There are going to be certain times where, I mean, we found however many yards at Oakmont, but I don't think we can find any more. So I think we're pretty much pushed up against the limit as far as that golf course is concerned. So I think you're going to see that these places have now pretty much run out of room. And so they're going to have to rely on what their architecture has, which are wonderful, beautiful greens that are at tournament speeds are pretty good defense. And then they're probably just going to have to grow the rough a little bit thicker and maybe narrow the fairways to provide, require precision, which always trumps distance, right? I mean, the best ball strikers usually win. Sometimes a golfer will overpower a golf course, but I think if you look at the history of major champions, yeah, Tiger Woods and Jack Nicklaus were great. They were long for their time, but they're also amazing ball strikers. So I think it's just getting precision to a place where you've got to have that ability to do that if nothing happens with the ball. And I'm happy to answer that question as it relates to what I think is the most important question, part of this, which nobody talks about, is the environmental aspect of it. We built a golf course that's going to host the LPGA Championship this summer, the PGA Championship in 2 years in Frisco, Texas, and from the back tee to the sort of back hole locations, it can play over 8,000 yards. And that's because it's a modern golf course built with knowing and understanding, well, it takes a lot more money to maintain and fertilize and water an 8,000-yard golf course than it does, something else. And nobody really talks about it. Plus just all the environmental. I mean, I'm a firm believer that golf courses are not an environmental hazard, right? I think that they provide amazing habitat. I think the golf course superintendents, certainly the ones we work with, but the vast, vast majority are great stewards of the land. They're not trying to do anything or apply anything that will ultimately leave a bad mark on the landscape. So I think we as are good stewards of landscapes, but the cost and the amount of water, which is obviously going to just become more and more of a precious resource in order to build golf courses or stretch golf courses, if nothing is done, I think that's a legitimate concern.
Yeah, you don't hear as much talk these days about the environmental concerns, but certainly there's water shortages all over the place. It's a big deal. Gil, you may have just answered my next question, but I was going to ask you, if someone gave you a blank slate and they asked you to build a course today under fairly generic conditions that could potentially host major championships going forward, ideally speaking, what total course distance or yardage would you have in mind for, let's say, a par 72 layout? And you may have just said it, maybe 8,000 yards.
I think that's the reality. And I think you provide plenty of options to move up and set it up. I think the best architecture provides flexibility and provides opportunities that on any given day you have the opportunity to set a hole up. If the wind is blowing in your face, you set it up shorter, et cetera. And I think that flexibility in the design is something that I applaud somebody like Kerry Haig and at the PGA of America and John Bodenhammer at the USGA. They look for that flexibility, and they look to how can we correlate hole locations with distance. Like if we have, you saw, I don't know if you watched the tournament this weekend, but Philly Cricket Club was amazing when they played the little, I think it was 14th in the routing for the tournament. Great little short par 3, and they played a tee up and a really hard hole location. And I think that sort of flexibility and variety and the gumption to use it from the setup guys is really all we can do. People always ask, what are you doing on tournament week? when you worked at a club that's hosting a major championship, and said, well, I'm watching, but our job is done. If we've done our job, we've restored elements of the golf course that will allow the setup team to set it up any way they want. And we have to trust that they're going to use all of that, the entire kitchen, and throw everything into the meal in order to prepare something that's going to ultimately be something that will serve the club well, will serve the membership well, will serve the golf course well, and the architecture, and ultimately, make sure that the players have a really good test and a great examination. So I think while we focus on distance, and that would be an appropriate part of building a golf course for major championship, it can't be the only part. It has to be part of a bigger, wider variety of hole locations and angles and different setup options that ultimately yield the best tournaments.
Yeah, in terms of tightening the fairways, and I grew up in New York, and I can remember, it's not unusual that you would get a pretty wet spring, which I think they've had up there this year. But it was always a concern that if maybe you weren't going to get a lot of rain, and you're hosting a U.S. Open in June. Are the sprinkler irrigation systems today, are they enough that you can grow that rough to whatever you need it to be, or is it not as good as Mother Nature?
Well, nothing's ever as good as Mother Nature, but yes, they can get the rough where they want it to be. And that preparation starts. That would have started at Oakmont back in last summer, last fall. You put the grass to bed at a really healthy, juicy height, and well fertilized, well fed for its winter nap, and then basically when it comes out in the spring, it's looking for more, and you can hit it with fertilizer and water. So yes, the everything, all of these golf courses that host major championships have the ability to get things as close as they would like for the championship. Now, if it was just a complete drought and it was 95 degrees every day, they wouldn't be able to do it. But just given normal weather conditions, even if there was a lack of rain, they would be able to supplement that with irrigation and get things where they need it to be.
Got it. Bill, I'm not going to ask you any specifics here, but it's my understanding that you're doing some work on a very well-known oceanside course in Palm Beach. From what I've read, new drainage will be added, the pump system will be upgraded, and a fair amount of the course will be raised about 1 to 2 feet to protect from encroaching water. We can imagine that such a process is very significant in cost. Is this something that most seaside courses in the U.S. will have to take on in order to remain consistently playable in the coming years?
Yeah, thank you for not mentioning where it is or what it is, but yes, we consult with 2 other clubs in the Northeast on this sea rise and ultimately mitigation that's going to be required to address it. I think any club that has a coastal site, and I'm not weighing one side or the other on the political argument. I'm just seeing what we're dealing with in reality right now, and whether that's cyclical or whether it's permanent, again, that's for other people to decide. But I think every course that sits on the coastline in the United States or anywhere in the world has got to start asking serious questions about what does the future look like, and do at least some mitigation studies to say, okay, given the data that NOAA has produced, in 2040, this is what the mean high tide level is going to look like in 2050, et cetera. Just be prepared, do your homework. Whether they have the financial resources to do it or not, that's obviously, every club is going to be very, very different. But I think it will be an alarming wake-up call to most clubs that have a coastal location to see what the projections are going forward.
Right. I mean, and as you said, without turning this into a political matter, we don't know what the situation will be in 30 years, but I think it'd be pretty hard for anybody spending time in Southeast Florida or anywhere on the coast in Florida to say that the water has not been, getting higher and higher every year. So I think for anybody to try and ignore that would probably be pretty foolish.
Yeah, and it's the tidal events, the frequency, and this is, all up and down the coast, the clubs that we consult with, they're more frequent. the flooding events are more frequent. The king tides they just happen more frequently. It's some of the data that we've seen from some of these courses is just shocking in the frequency. If you look at the data from sort of 1990 to 2000, then you look from 2000 to 2010, 2010 to 2020, during those windows, the frequency has, I mean, it's easily doubled for these tidal events. And so it's not, you know, the data is proving that something is going on for sure.
Yeah, I get you. Gil, let me get you moving. Let me ask you really quickly. Augusta National is likely the best known course in the world at this point. Your perspective is so unique. What makes it so special aside from it hosting the most watched golf tournament every year?
I mean, I honestly think it's the perfect design from the standpoint of, you know, you had arguably the most talented golf architect in the world and easily the most accomplished golfer in the world, you know, collaborating at a period of time on a beautiful piece of land. They got the routing right because it's not an easy piece of property. I mean, there are hills and obviously there's a lot of up and down, and they could have very easily made a mess of how you get down from the clubhouse and how you get back up, but they didn't. I mean, they worked the land beautifully in a number of different ways. So the variety and the routing is amazing. But when I say it's a perfect design, and I think a lot of that goes back to the roots of Augusta National design philosophy coming from the old course in St. Andrews, it's that the special sauce that we're all looking for as golf architects is that level of precision conversation, like the level of precision to go play golf. Like if I just want to go play golf and have a nice round of golf, the level of precision at Augusta National is fairly low. I can big wide fairways. I can hit my ball unless I dunk it in, you know, down an amen corner. I'm probably going to play with the same ball all the way around. You can find it, hit it, play it, and get around the golf course. But the level of precision required to play it well, we see every April that the level of precision required to play Augusta National well and to score is off the charts. And so a golf course that can have both of those components, that is playable and enjoyable for the masses and with a rather low, and I know I don't want that to sound like it's a knock because it's actually a badge of honor that, you know, you can kind of play a golf course and play it around. I think Mackenzie would be thrilled with that. But then the ability through setup, like we talked about earlier, and through hole locations and maintenance, you can dial that up to a place where the best players in the world are going to have to hit very, very precise golf shots in order to score and play well there. And I think you combine that with the history of the Masters tournament, you combine that with the beauty of that landscape, and it's, you know, it's an unparalleled experience, and rightfully so. You know, as you said, the most famous golf course in the world.
Yeah, just a beautiful place. I'm going to hit you with one more quick one. Any new trends that you're seeing in golf course design, renovation, or restoration today? I know that your approach is more art than science, but I guess AI could potentially bring some interesting innovations into the business. What are your thoughts?
It won't bring any interesting innovations to me. I have no interest in having to try and figure out a new way to do it. I'm really happy with getting in a bulldozer, getting dirty, as long as my body allows me to continue to move this way. I think it's boots on the ground, hands in the dirt. That's the way that's where you build golf courses and where you design them and where their heart and soul comes from. So I'm going to be old school in that regard. I did watch TGL, and I thought it was a blast. I thought it was fun to, you know, being from the Northeast like you know, it's cold and I want to see golf. And if it's golf on a massive simulator and the best players in the world, you know, playing golf holes that are part video game, part real golf holes, I think that was a really cool experience. So I enjoyed, I'm not such a Luddite that I won't accept that there's a place for technology in the game of golf. I just probably won't use it very much in my own work.
Yeah, well, you're doing really well to keep it going for sure. Gil, I'm going to call it a night here. It's so kind of you to come on and join us at this late hour. I can't thank you enough for being so generous with your time. I'm personally so grateful for everything you've done for the game of golf, and specifically your tremendous work at Wingfoot. We look forward to watching your latest work at Oakmont and wish you all the best. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for having me on, and thanks to you for all the work you're doing. It's amazing stuff, and I was delighted that you asked me to be on, and I'm really thankful. This was a lot of fun. So thanks.
That's awesome, Gil. Thanks.